This lesson will be about the struggle. The struggle here refers to how learning can oftentimes be very difficult. And what we'll present are some observations and experiments performed by psychologists, and they have found that there are cultural differences in attitudes towards learning. Now, the cultures in question, will categorize them as follows: Western cultures, like the USA, Canada, Europe, and Eastern cultures, like Japan, Korea, and China. And so psychologists went to different classrooms in these different cultures and made observations, and then furthermore conducted experiments, and one of which we'll see in a moment. So here's an example. Psychologists took note of which students are asked to the board to show their work. Well, in Western cultures, it tended to be the competent students, but in Eastern cultures, it tended to be the weaker student. And what does it mean if a student is struggling with a concept or a skill? Well, psychologists discovered that in Western cultures, the struggling tended to mean the student has low ability, whereas in Eastern cultures, the struggle meant that the student had an opportunity to learn. It was considered a natural part of the learning process. And finally, what is a major factor that causes success? In Western cultures, a very common idea is that it's natural talent or smarts that is the principal cause of success, whereas in Eastern cultures, the predominant idea was hard work was the key to success. Now let's consider one of many experiments that were performed to study this concept of the struggle and whether there are cultural differences. Here's the title of the article in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. In this experiment, there were Japanese students and North American students, in particular Canadians. And there are 4 groups in the experiment, and they're going to be given this task called the rat. So to understand this experiment, we first have to understand what is the rat. The rat stands for Remote Association Test, and it measures a form of verbal creativity. Here's how it's done. Subjects are given 3 words, and then their job is to find a 4th word that is associated with the other 3. And if you consider these 3 words, blue, cake, and cottage, you can kind of see that the word cheese is related to all 3. Blue cheese and cheesecake and cottage cheese. So sometimes the word makes a compound word with the test item, or sometimes it's just related in meaning. So the remote association test requires that you sort of search your vocabulary, your stored vocabulary, to find a 4th word that is related to the other 3. Now notice the task can be made easy or more difficult by the choice of words. Here's an example. See, home, and stomach. You can pause here if you want to try to find the remote associate. You might have come up with sick, seasick, homesick, and you might be sick to your stomach. Now, psychologists have found that some individuals are just very good at this type of task. They are fast and efficient at finding that 4th word that is associated with the other 3, whereas other individuals find it more challenging. And so the fact that there are differences in the performance on this kind of tasks, this is why psychologists argue that it sort of measures a kind of verbal creativity. The individuals that can quickly come up with the 4th word, it's as if they have stored in their brains, in their memory systems, words and their meanings, but they have connections in such a way that they can find remotely associated words and concepts more easily than others. It's as if other individuals, they store the words and their meanings in a more isolated fashion. They're less connected to other remotely associated words. So in the experiment you'll see in a moment, psychologists use this remote association test not because it measures creativity, but because it's a task that can be made easy or hard depending on the 3 cue words that are given to the subject. So now we'll return to the experiment. There are 4 groups in the experiment. And notice 2 of the groups, 1 in each culture, are going to have an experience of success because they were given the easy remote association test. The test items made it easy to come up with the 4th word. By contrast, Two other groups in the experiment had an experience of failure. They were given a remote association test with very difficult items. It was difficult to find that fourth word that was related, associated with the other three. So researchers wanted to know if culture influenced the subject's reaction to failure and/or success. So in both cultures, there are some students who had success and some that had failure. And psychologists were interested whether there was a cultural difference in how students responded to failure, how they reacted to failure. And remember, this is related to the struggle because oftentimes we fail in the learning process. That learning is a struggle. Failure is the struggle. And so psychologists were interested in different attitudes that you might find in different cultures. Now, after all groups had completed their remote association test with either relative success or relative failure, all subjects were given the opportunity to do extra test items if they wanted to. And here's the key. Researchers then said, go ahead and do extra ones if you want, but then they sort of left the room and they secretly measured how long subjects persisted on extra test items. And now let's take a look at the results. Okay, we're going to be plotting the data on this graph. So notice the y-axis here is persistence in seconds. And recall that the psychologists left the room and allowed all four groups to continue working on extra problems. And so psychologists just measured how long did subjects in each group, on average, continue to do extra problems, extra remote association test items. So that's persistence in seconds. The x-axis then, we're going to group it into the two conditions in the experiment, a success condition or failure. So some of the subjects had the easy remote association test, some had the hard one. And here's the data for the Canadians. Notice that when the Canadians had a success experience, they had the easy remote association test, they persisted longer than when they had a failure experience because they had the hard remote association test. And you might pause it here to make a prediction. What do you think you might find for the Japanese subjects? The data for the Japanese subjects was the opposite. For the Japanese subjects, they persisted longer after a failure experience. After they were given the hard remote association test, they spent longer doing extra items than if they had just had success because they were doing easy remote association tests. Now let's just handle some nuts and bolts here. When we give a description of results, we're trying to answer the question, what happened? What does the graph show? So here would be two statements sort of describing the data. Japanese students persisted longer after doing the hard rat, a failure experience, compared to the easy rat, whereas Canadian students persisted longer after doing the easy rat. So in a description, we're just describing what happened. We're not trying to figure out why, just what is it that happened. And so you can just read the data right off the graph. On the other hand, an explanation seeks an answer to the question, why did it happen? And explanations often are about causes, the causes of things. So what caused the result? What does the graph mean? So here now we're going to get psychological and say things like Eastern students were more motivated by failure. Western students were more motivated by success. So for Eastern cultures, an experience of failure may motivate individuals to work on the things that they're struggling with. Whereas in the West, a Canadian group, they appeared to be more motivated by a success experience, as if they perceived it, oh, they're good at these things, we're going to work more on those items that they're already good at. So here psychologists argue that there's an influence of culture. And it's instructive for those of us in Western cultures to make comparisons to how other people in other cultures embrace the struggle. Perhaps we can learn from these other cultures. Let's look at one more example of differing attitudes towards learning. Now imagine you're a student and you are assigned to write a paper, maybe just a paragraph. And then of course you hand in the paper and the teacher evaluates it and marks it up a bit, and then they give you a grade, a B-. Let's say you're not so thrilled with that, B-. But now You're given a choice to examine another student's paragraph. And here are your choices. You can look at a paper from a student who received an F on the paper or one who received an A. Which would you rather examine? Now, in this example, you can only choose one. So we can think about some of the motivations why you would choose one or the other. Maybe you want to look at the F paper so you can feel good about yourself. At least you didn't get an F. You got a B minus. That might make you feel better, but you might actually learn more from looking at a paper that received an A. Perhaps we could learn more from looking at what a well-written paragraph looked like. So there might be different kinds of motivations for examining these two papers. And some psychologists call the difference in approach here one of a mindset. That the individuals who are opting to look at the F paper, they're likely concerned about their own self-esteem. They want to feel better about themselves by comparing themselves to somebody who did worse. There's another group of individuals who make the choice of looking at the A paper. And the suggestion here is they want to grow. They want to learn. Psychologists call these two mindsets the fixed mindset and a growth mindset. Notice in the growth mindset, it's not about, trying to look good compared to somebody else. It's about actually learning and growing as a writer in this case. So here we are left with the learner here. I must make more of an effort to improve my writing. But what does that mean about me? And so here again, we see this idea. There are two views about the effort that you might put into improving your writing. The fact that you have to put in effort, does that indicate lack of ability? Or does the effort activate one's own ability? So in this instance, then, the effort would be like practicing writing. And then getting the feedback and making corrections and reading other examples of good writing, right? That's the effort. But notice, if you put in that effort, then your ability as a writer will improve. So effort is the thing that unlocks ability. But we can get trapped into this way of thinking that, effort means that I lack ability. But that's a dead end. If we want to grow, we want to think of effort as activating our abilities. So, obviously then, educators and parents and psychologists are going to invite learners to look at effort from this perspective here. Effort activates ability. So it may be that in Western cultures, there is this idea that effort indicates lack of ability. And it may be then to shift our attitude towards the second one here, that effort activates ability, we're going to have to make a concerted effort to think of effort in this way. And so if we want to improve our abilities, we're going to have to put in the effort. So in this final slide here, we're going to compare individuals with a fixed mindset with a growth mindset. People with a fixed mindset tend to believe that intelligence is static, and that leads to a desire to look smart, and therefore a tendency to avoid challenges, give up easily, see effort as fruitless or worse, ignore useful negative feedback, and feel threatened by the success of others. And all of these attitudes and behaviors are going to limit the potential of people with a fixed mindset. On the other hand, people with a growth mindset believe that intelligence can be developed, and that leads to a desire to learn, and therefore a tendency to embrace challenges, persist in the face of setbacks, see effort as the path to mastery, learn from criticism, and find lessons and inspiration in the success of others. This is the path that we want to be on, to maximize our potential.